Hi students, welcome to HSC Biology and Module 8, Not Infectious Disease and Disorders. This is video number 10, where we look at the incidence of nutritional disease. In this little section that kind of closes off the second of the inquiry questions in this module, we're being asked to collect and represent data to show the incidence, prevalence and mortality rates of non-infectious diseases using nutritional diseases as a specific example. So this means we need to be able to talk a little bit about the types of data that are collected around non-infectious diseases and disorders, to understand some of the terms that are used to describe some of this data, and also to describe the characteristics of this data, such as incidence, prevalence and mortality, and to be able to apply some of the data in the setting of nutritional disease. So in this video, I just want to give you a bit of an introduction to, I guess, the types of data that you can see that are associated with these sorts of types of diseases, and to give you a sense of what you're sort of looking for in each of these different data sets. So we talk about descriptive studies, and these are ones that provide a lot of information that relates to patterns in terms of disease incidence. So we can talk about frequency, we can talk about demographic information, whether it's a disease that is more likely to affect younger people or older people, men or women, people in certain types of occupations, or people with certain socioeconomic status and those sorts of things. We might also find that there's a geographic link between sufferers of a particular type of disease and the incidence of those diseases. So they're descriptive studies. The second type are analytical studies. Now, analytical studies are ones that are formulating a testable hypothesis. So in terms of what data we get from a descriptive study, we may even find that data from a descriptive study informs an analytical study. So we've analysed this kind of broad data set, and now we're trying to narrow it down a little bit. Maybe we did find a slightly higher incidence in men that worked in a particular occupation of a certain socioeconomic status. So we start to formulate a hypothesis around that. Does this disease affect men of a certain socioeconomic status in a certain job? Or was that just coincidental in terms of the information that we got? So now we start to kind of do an analytical study. We stop looking at a breadth and we start to narrow in. We start to get a little bit deeper into our study to try and get more people of a similar type rather than just representatives of a wide range. And then you've got the third type, which are the intervention studies. Now, the intervention studies are the ones that I guess are at the next level as well. So now we've sort of carried out our descriptive, we've got a general idea, we've carried out our analytical, and now we've got a more specific idea. So now what we want to do is say, well, now we're going to target these particular people who maybe are in these situations, try and raise their awareness. Now, of course, this could be something very specific, such as the exposure of certain types of people who work in certain industries to heavy metals or to potential asbestos that might be in certain places, or it might be a wider population, but something that's specific to, say, ultraviolet radiation and the link that we think there is between ultraviolet radiation exposure and melanoma. What we want to know, though, is whether or not any intervention strategies are having any impact on the numbers. So usually that's going to be around public health campaigns, the specifics of a certain treatment, a drug, a vaccine, anything like that we think is now targeting the particular problem that we're looking at to see how effective it's actually been. So when we're carrying out our analytical studies, we're often looking at 4 different groups of people within a particular study type or a data set. We're looking at morbidity, which is the total number of cases all up. We're looking at mortality, which is the number of people who have died with the disease. And of course, we're in the age of COVID, and so we know some people die of COVID, and we know some people die with COVID, so that there are sometimes comorbidities, other things that other diseases that people have, or just other lifestyle issues that may be impacting. It may simply be a function of age that has contributed to maybe a slightly higher likelihood of a particular consequence of a disease. And we've also talked about previously these terms incidence and prevalence. And incidence is the new cases, prevalence is the number of sufferers at any given time. What can we do with the data? Well, that depends on the type of data that we're looking at, and that's one of the reasons why we need to know whether we're looking at a descriptive data set, an analytical data set, an intervention data set. And so what we're trying to do is, as we always do with any data, we're trying to identify trends. Now, sometimes we do that with tables. Sometimes it's more easy to do that with graphs or charts to see whether or not the incidence of diseases are rising, or whether they're falling, or whether we can actually see a change in any of these patterns as a result of some sort of intervention. We also use them to help determine if there's particular patterns of susceptibility. Are there certain groups in our society that are more or less likely to suffer from a particular disease? How effective have our treatment methods been? And is there anywhere else we can move forward in terms of research? What are the possible focus areas that we may be able to look at in the future to help address this particular area? Finally, we want to know if there's some implications for public health. Public health is a very large budget, a lot of money that is spent in public health, but also because of that, very important that we're aware that are there ways where we can have early intervention rather than later treatment. I guess one of the metaphors that's sometimes used is putting barriers at the top of the cliff, which may be an intervention strategy, as opposed to ambulances at the bottom of the cliff trying to deal with the fallout, literally. So it's one of those things that we are always doing in this area of disease study to see what sort of things have been effective, what sort of things could be effective, and what sort of patterns we can see in the data that we collect. So let's take that sort of general discussion around the sort of data that we can get associated with disease or human condition, and then apply it specifically to nutritional situations. So here's some relatively recent data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Just some of the different data that can pop out from time to time. And one of the things that's important about these sorts of dot points is how you would interpret this data. So when we throw some of this information at you, what is it telling you? What sort of things can we conclude from it? And usually we'll give you a few pieces of data to put together to build up a story. So you can see, for example, less than 1 in 10 adults in 2017-2018 met the recommended daily vegetable consumption. About a third of Australia's energy is from discretionary foods, and that is highest for teenagers in the 14 to 18% age bracket at 41%. For adults aged 51 to 55, alcoholic drinks account for more than 1/5 of their discretionary food intake. 22%. 7.3% of the total burden of disease in Australia in 2015 was due to poor diet. And 7.1% of children aged 2 to 17 and 9.1% of adults consumed sugar-sweetened beverages daily in 2017-18. What sort of conclusions can we draw from this sort of data? What sort of questions does this data throw up? What are you thinking when you read this sort of data? What sort of interventions, what additional information would you like? Would you want to carry out an analytical study on particular groups? What sort of information would you be wanting to find out? If you wanted to initiate a public health campaign, who and what would you be targeting? These are the sorts of questions that we want you to be asking when you're looking at data like this, and we'll give you some more examples in future videos. Thanks for watching.